exactly how much time, but they'd been there for some time, because he said it was for many days until Paul became annoyed with the slave girl, right? So they've been preaching in the town, and I would say that it's pretty obvious here that the jailer has heard some of what Paul has taught, and at the very least recognizes that he represents Jesus. He represents a different kind of faith or a different kind of worship. And in seeing what's happened here, that touches the jailer's heart, right? And why is it that it touches his heart? How is this situation such that it opens his eyes to see it?
Well, when you've got an earthquake, shake, that's going to shake everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's shook open the doors, turned the prisoners loose.
Yeah.
And the fact that they didn't just run away
Yeah.
and leave him to be killed for allowing them to
Right.
escape. They told him,
Mm-hmm.
don't worry, don't harm you.
Right.
And that showed him
Mm-hmm.
their concern for him, who's Roman, and their guard.
Like Dad had mentioned, one of the things that happens if you're a Roman person who's in charge of the jailhouse here, the jailer, and you let somebody escape, the common punishment for that is they're going to kill you or you kill yourself. Right? That was one of the things that the Romans did. If you failed in your duty to Caesar, then they would kill themselves. They would fall on their sword and be. That's kind of where that terminology comes from. Fall on your sword kind of a thing. It comes from the Roman time. That's what they would do if they failed in completing the mission that they were supposed to do. And so that's what we see the jailer here about to do. So he's ready to kill himself because he thinks all the prisoners have gone, right? But Paul hollers out at him and tells him, don't do that. We're all still here, right? And so that's showing to the jailer that Paul and Silas care about him, right? Whereas anyone else in that kind of situation might be like, well, I'll just be quiet and let him kill himself because he was the jailer. He's the one who put us in here, right? That's a worldly kind of thought. But again, when you're looking from that eternal mindset, the eternal perspective that Paul and Silas have, they see this guy not as, an enemy, but they see him as someone who is confused by Satan, confused by the world, and as a potential soul that can have eternal life. And so whenever he's attempting to hurt himself, they stop him. And then because of their care, their concern for him and his life, then that sparks this question that comes up. And this is the question of the ages, right? Sirs, what must I do to be saved? Right? I mean, that's one of the greatest questions for all mankind from the very beginning, right, through to now. What must I do to be saved? And what is their answer? Believe, right? You got to have faith. Hebrews 11 and verse 6, if you don't believe that God exists, then there's no way that you can please him, right? It says it is impossible. Hebrews 11:6 teaches us that. And so without faith, it is impossible. So you have to believe that God is and that he exists, period. You have to have that faith, that belief in Christ and that Jesus is the Son of God. You have to have that faith in him, period. Without it, you got nothing. And he says, what else do? They tell him that, and then they go on to what? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house, right? So that which is of first importance, in a sense, if you will, here is you got to believe. If you don't have the faith, it ain't happening. And then he takes the faith and he expounds on that from that perspective, and he teaches the word of the Lord. So he teaches them the gospel. He teaches them the death, the burial, the resurrection, that Christ is the Son of the living God. He expounds on those things because, again, this jailer has to have some context, right? He has to have heard something about Paul and Silas and what they've been teaching in the days and weeks that they've already been in the city. And so now Paul takes and he expounds on that, and then the conclusion of that, what they've given him, the jailer, is to be baptized, right? So we see where all of that is tied together. And it's important that we don't try to separate any part of that out, right? But we take it all together as one complete package to recognize this is what God teaches us, and this is what we need to do. I do also think it's interesting that the jailer also shows care and concern for them, that he brings them out and washes and cleanses their wounds, right? So in the middle of all of the stuff that they're going through, God is still providing. He is still taking care of them. He's provided the situation. He's provided the release. He's provided the opportunity. And then Paul and Silas have utilized that opportunity and provision and time to share the gospel with the jailer. And then God provides also in the healing, in the cleansing of Paul and of Silas as well.
So with the jailer's household, there's above the jail, adjacent to the jail. I would assume not a very large jail. I mean, kind of if you ran into a dungeon, they could be underneath or something.
Yeah.
It just seems like that would be pretty hard logistics. If all this shit loose, everything opened up, he pulls them two out, shuts it, has the faith that everything's going to be good, and he's going to go back to the house. Something logistically to me would think that that's...
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe they heard all that singing, all that praying.
Right. But, I mean, to me, it's very possible that could be the case. I really don't know historically. Yeah, I don't have the historical background to know on that piece of it, like where the jailer would be living in context to everything else. I do know that, like if you look at our jails today, we don't just, put the prisoners in there, then everybody leaves and goes home. There's always somebody around, so I would assume that most likely the jailer is there, maintaining some sort of 24-hour guard, whether he's just sitting in an office in the front or whatever. So I'm sure that he was around, and that was probably a piece of what's going on here as far as hearing what they're praying and they're singing and those things of that nature. So, I mean, it would make sense also his quick reaction to what's going on. You know what I mean? So to me, yeah, it makes sense that he's probably living there, but I don't know that exactly. I don't have the historical context to tell you that piece for sure. But it would make sense that would be the case.
Why would they include his household too?
That's a great question. Why are we including the household? That's another great question. There you go, Perry. Why wouldn't you? Yeah. It's like we're becoming Jewish in here or something, right? You got to answer each question with a question. No, but... Right. I mean, to me, that only makes sense, right? So if you hear about Jesus and you hear about this situation, you see what's happened in the jail, why wouldn't you share that with your family? Why wouldn't you want them to hear and to know those things, right? And the same for us today. We know the gospel who are sitting in here. Why wouldn't we want to share that with our family? You know what I mean? That, going back to why wouldn't it? That's, the whole key piece of it is we want to bring as many people as possible, and the people we care about the most are the ones that are right in our family. So why wouldn't we? And if the jailer has this opportunity, yeah. And we see other instances like with Lydia. It says Lydia and her household, right? So the folks who are the servants there, the folks who live there under her household, the same with the jailer, those who are in his house. I would assume potentially his family, but also like we read here, the servants and things there within the household that hear the gospel and then believe and obey. Exactly.
I don't know if that would have been the situation otherwise, because it sounds like you've got to stay on top of that jail 24/7 and on prison cases.
Yeah, he'd have to. I mean, you got to either himself or someone else has to consistently be there, right? And you brought out one of the things that I put at the end, which comes from I think it's Genesis chapter 50 or somewhere in there, where the brothers of Joseph come to him, and they're afraid that he's going to kill them after their daddy dies. And he tells them, what you intended to be harmful to me, God intended for good. Well, a similar situation here. What the town, what the people, what the magistrates, what all those folks intended to be harmful to Paul and Silas, what the world intends to be harmful to us, God uses for good. And so that's another great example of that aspect. And then we need to keep that in mind when we're in the tough time, right? When you're part of the reason why Paul and Silas can sing and can, have worship in that time is because they know that God is in control and He is the one who is guiding the plan. And no matter what man intends to be harmful to us, God's going to use it for good. Whether that means, the earthquake happens and our bonds pop off and we're able to baptize somebody, or it may mean that we die, but what we've said and in our death affects someone else to be able to have good in their life. The good isn't necessarily that, makes us happy. We may continue in suffering even to death. That's okay. God will use whatever the situation is to achieve that which is good, in spite of what man intends to be harmful. And sometimes that's hard for us to hang on to. And the more we grow and mature in our faithfulness, the more we can grow and mature in our understanding and our walk with Christ, the more we're able to see that and allow that to come through when we're walking through those struggles, when we're walking through those difficult times. But yeah, that's one of the things I have written down here is what man intends as harm, God uses for good. And it reminds me of what the one preacher out in California said during COVID. And some reporter asked him, said, aren't you afraid of having worship service whenever they've said it's against the law to do that? And his response was, well, I've always wanted to do a prison ministry. And that's kind of what we see here with Paul and Silas, right? They get locked up in prison. Well, they just keep on doing what they're doing. And we see that again also with Paul later on when he gets taken to Rome and he's under house arrest. He's locked up. What's he doing? He's writing letters. He's sharing the gospel with the household of Caesar. He's continuing to do the job. So it doesn't matter if you're free or if you're in prison or where you are, what your job is, what your location, wherever you are, you're living for Jesus. Wherever you are, whatever situation you're in, you're sharing the gospel. I think that's another key piece that we can pull out of this situation here. I'm going to go on with 35. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison, and they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city, and visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So I kind of like this section right here because in spite of Paul's situation, he's not just laying down, right? I wrote down in my Bible, Paul is getting a little spicy. He's like, no, you're going to do this to me illegally. You're going to do it. You're at least going to own up to it in front of everybody else. You did these things that you were not supposed to do. I'm not just going to slink away and let you get away with it. We're going to hold you to task over it. And so he was very bold in standing in this situation. And it's, again, it's one of those things that, could go the wrong way for you, right? But Paul, essentially being aware of and knowing the law, aware of and knowing the culture and things of that nature, he was able to leverage that and put a little bit of onus, if you will, on those people that did wrong. And it's not necessarily that he's pointing out to them that they don't know Christ, but he's pointing out to them what you did, regardless, was wrong, and you shouldn't have done that. And so he's holding them accountable to those things.
Paul was a Roman citizen.
Mm-hmm.
By being a Roman citizen, he had rights.
Yeah.
And they knew that they had crossed the line because he wasn't.
Right. Exactly.
They were afraid.
Yeah. They realized what they'd done it wrong. It was this, especially whenever they find out his citizenship, and they're like, "Ooh, hold on, we messed up." Yeah. Yeah, that would be the assumption there. Absolutely.
In another place, when Paul's confronted like this, the person confronts him and says, it cost me a lot
Yeah.
to get my Roman citizenship.
He said, no, I was born that way. Right, exactly. Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's a whole, puts it in also a different category, right? If you're a naturalized, natural-born citizen versus someone who just paid money to get it. Yeah. And again, verse 39, they apologize, right? They send them out, and they ask them to leave the city. Well, Paul doesn't just immediately, shuck off out of town, but he goes over to Lydia's house. He checks on the brothers. He does his due diligence to help with the church and make sure that everyone's established and doing okay there, in spite of all the events that have just happened. And then, when he feels like everything's good, then they leave, right? So he's not leaving on the magistrate's agenda. He's living on his own and on the agenda that God has given him, right? And so that's also important, because sometimes we can, again, if you go back to the COVID piece and how, a lot of fear and things were used there to suppress. One person was talking about it the other day, and they said, what kind of weird situation are we in when we close the churches and open the liquor stores? And that's what happened essentially during COVID. They wanted to shut down the churches and open up all the liquor stores. And you're like, well, what in the world? That doesn't make any sense. It's not how you get through any kind of situation or difficulty, whether it's personally or as a nation. And what are you thinking, right? But that's kind of what America did. And, to a degree, many of us were like, oh, okay, we need to be, we sort of pumped the brakes and held back a little bit instead of leaning forward into it, and following through and just trusting in God and moving forward with it. But, the way Paul handles it is he's like, I'm going to be about God's business first and then worry about what the world takes care of. All right, let's move on into chapter 17. Now when they had passed through, I'm going to get this wrong, Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, and as was his custom on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, and set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men have turned the world upside down, have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And the people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So they move on to Thessalonica, and again, Paul goes through his standard method of operation, right? He goes to the synagogue and he preaches in the synagogue, and he shares Christ there, proving that he had to suffer, proving that he had to rise from the dead, and then also proving that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the chosen one of God. And so he does that. And then, of course, we have that some believe, some don't believe, right? A part of my study for this morning's sermon pointed out something on this here in verse 4. It says, and some were persuaded. The word there for persuaded is the Greek word peitho, P-E-I-T-H-O. And it can be translated as persuaded, as trust, or as obey. And so with that word, when we look at it from the Greek, it can kind of go a lot of different directions from the perspective of, and some of them obeyed, some of them trusted, some of them were persuaded, right? So this word is a little bit more encapsulated differently, I think, than just, well, yeah, I'm inclined to believe you. This goes beyond just the inclination or the thought that, yeah, I think you might be right, but it goes to the level of trusting. So not just saying, well, I think you might be right, but getting on board, believing, more the idea of having a faith, having a trust, having a desire to join, right? Because it says persuaded to join. So they stepped into, and then also the idea of obedience that comes with that word. So it's not just I think you're right, but it goes to that level of, I trust what you're saying, I believe what you're saying, and I'm going to be obedient now to what you're saying, right? So it goes a lot further along down the road than just, well, I've got this inclination to think that you're correct, but more along the lines of, I believe it, I trust it, and I'm obedient to what you're saying. So it takes on a whole different meaning, if you will, a deeper meaning to that word there about how they responded. Right, it's a little bit more than just a general, gentle persuasion. It goes a lot deeper than that to trust and goes to the point of obedience. In John chapter 3 and verse 36, when John himself is talking, and he's talking about salvation. He's talking about being saved from the wrath of God. And he says, those who believe will be saved. Those who do not obey will remain in the wrath of God. Well, the obey word there is this same word right here. It's just with the prefix a, meaning the opposite of, right? They do not obey. They do not petho. They do not trust. They do not obey. They're not persuaded in the direction of Christ. And so it's a little deeper onus than I think the way the ESV puts it through. Does anybody else in verse 4 have a different word there? It says, and some of them were, in the ESV it says persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. All the other versions have persuaded? Believed? Yeah. Well, the Greek word for belief is pisteuo. And you hear pisteuo and pitho, pisteuo, you hear how they're very similar and have very similar ideas, and they're kind of linked together in a sense of the root of the idea of the word behind it. Which if you go again to John chapter 3 and verse 36, the King James, I'm pretty sure it is there, and in other versions will say, he who does not believe versus he who does not obey. But they are two different words. The one who says he believes in the Son shall be saved, that's pistos, which is the Greek word for faith. And the other one is a pethane, which is the Greek word for obey, trust, or persuasion. All right, I'm going to leave off right there on that, and then we'll come back and hit this section right here as we get started next Sunday. Any points, comments, or questions? Okay, lesson is yours. Thank you very much.